So first of all, we have finished the morning session was about the sacred and the secular. So where are we now? We are going to be discussing well-being, love and justice. And my brief is to just mention, bullet point, the themes that John will elaborate. And those points are, of course, to do with well-being, love and justice. The first point is paradigm of integrated well-being and justice. Here we go with the jargon, inner, outer world, spirit, etc., which you all have. But the key word I think here is paradigm. And we can see already that we are talking about changing paradigms. Ananya talked about a new pedagogy, trying to open doors with new locks, with new keys, trying to open old locks with new keys. And we have seen in the whole field of development, which was a buzzword in the 60s and 70s, there too there have been paradigm shifts. So we talked then of development, then from there we slowly went to sustainable development. From there we have slowly moved to sustainability rather than sustainable development. And in the whole development paradigm, we talked about GDP. What were the indicators? What is a rich nation? Which is a poor nation? GDP, per capita income. From there came the idea, especially from Bhutan for instance, of gross national happiness. So how will a person who is living in a small hut in a village measure his well-being? This is close to the theme of well-being. What does he care how much steel or coal the country is producing? How many miles of railroad we have built or how many dams we have built? Does his children have a school to go to? If somebody falls sick, is there a primary health center or even some paramedical person who can help? And so on. So the indicators changed, so the change in paradigm, but again, closely linked to politics. When the government changed in Bhutan, this was very much underplayed. Naturally, capitalists will not like this. They don't want to build schools and hospitals. They probably feel the government should be doing that from the taxes it collects. And they should be left free in a free market to make profits. And those profits are measured in the GDP, the products they make. So, and there are many such, changes in the paradigm. For instance, Radhika was mentioning, about rivers and forests being accepted in jurisprudence as persons. So this whole idea of juridical persons itself is a shift in a legal paradigm. Now we already have, in India we definitely have deities who are juridical persons, So you have Ram Lalla. The Ayodhya case is fought in the name of Ram Lalla, the deity Ram, by his caretaker. Now if Ram, whom some say not even a historical figure, just a myth, can be a juridical person, why not the river in which we cannot dip our feet? So on and so forth. So these are all changes, but of course, these are all connected. None of these are in isolation. So I guess we will touch upon that. How do you understand conflict and peace building? Which is, I think, simple enough the question. What role do faith, hope, love and charity play in building caring communities? Now here, let me just clarify. It's love and charity, but the word used in the Bible is charity in English, which actually has the same meaning as love and compassion, one meaning. So, the actual quote in the Bible is, and now abideth, it's in the letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 13. The last verse is, and now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. So here charity in the Christian sense means love of all humankind, Not just love between individuals, which of course is part of it, but love of all humankind. So we're talking about putting man in the center here when we talk about caritas, which is the Latin word for charity in this phrase in the Bible. And it also means, in a loose sense, compassion. And Thomas Aquinas actually defined it, understood caritas as being the love of man for God. And therefore the love of man for man as being part of the love for God. So it's a deep thing. And it's a difficult, I don't know how I would handle it. But you are asked to address this and say, how do faith, hope and charity play a role in building caring communities?
I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I find that the word spirituality is one of those strange, amorphous words that disappear as soon as you try to approach it. You know, I remember as a philosophy student, we used to talk about concepts like time. You know, we all know what time is, but you try to define it, and it suddenly escapes. You know, is it duration? Is it what's on your watch? Is it, you know, lunar time, solar time? Whose calendar are you following? And I find spirituality to be that kind of notion. And I find in my own personal life, therefore, that when you try to approach it directly, it not necessarily escapes you exactly, but you tend to fall back on things that we've been trying to avoid, like religion. Well, it's not the same as religion, right? Or we say, well, no, it's connected to religion, it's sort of maybe the mystical practices within religion. You know, and we end up in all these tangles that we're very familiar with, because we face them all the time when we talk about these kind of things. And I think the same is to some extent true with the notion of well-being. To some extent, but not quite to the same extent. I mean, it's to some extent, obviously, the notion of well-being is culturally relative. I mean, some guy in the jungles of New Guinea might have a rather different notion of well-being than me, and you probably almost certainly have different ideas of well-being than I do. I mean, if your idea of fun is to stay home reading Das Kapital in German, weekends, enjoy. That might not be my idea of fun, okay? But there is a core, I think, and this is where it connects to these other broader notions of compassion, justice, and this kind of stuff. One of the terms my students use a lot, I don't know if your friends do this at all around the campus, is this notion of a safe space. Safe space being somewhere where you are secure, where your rights are observed, where you could be creative in whatever form that your creativity takes, right? Where you can find a sense of harmony or structure or something, and as you define it. And that seems to be the core of any idea of well-being. However much the empirical details may vary, there is that kind of conceptual center, which I think all of these systems share. So, if we want to move into some understanding of spirituality, it's a little different from our usual kind of language. I'm going to suggest two ideas that come from my own work and practice. Okay? The first one builds on, I think you actually said this, and I know you implied it, this question about the relationship between the material and the spiritual. That distinction, I mean, when those two words appear in the same sentence, almost always they're opposed to one another. It's either the spiritual or it's the material. And if you trace this historically, you can see the vast damage that kind of distinction has done, not simply philosophically, but in extremely practical terms. And religions themselves are frequently the main perpetrators of this kind of damage. I had a colleague once who actually worked for the UN. I had a colleague at another agency who worked for UNESCO. Okay? But that's slightly irrelevant. Lovely Trinidadian lady. And you can do this too if you want to. Hope she'd like to go around naked. He said, oh, that's a nice idea. It's hot in Trinidad, but she's in Paris, so it's also hot. But. So why? He said, I went to a girls' Catholic school. It was run by a bunch of nuns. When we had to take a bath, we had to wear a full body cloak, because you were not allowed to see the bodies of other girls, and you were not allowed to see your own body. You had to bathe covered, because, somehow this was sinful or something, right? Said, in later life she reacted so strongly against this kind of denigration of the body that she kind of went to the other edge and became kind of Buddhist, but whatever your version of that would be. If you trace that issue of the position of the body as clear material vehicle with which we, inhabit the world and run around, you will find that in fact huge damage has been done, and I think it is in a sense a kind of spiritual damage. It causes us to see the world, see other people, see our own bodies in ways which are essentially negative. It's also true that, I think it's true, that you rarely find the words spirituality and economics in the same sentence. But one of the fields in which I work is a field which is sometimes called solidarity economy. Solidarity economy operates, again, I don't know if this concept is familiar to people, it operates again at several levels. At a kind of empirical level, it's often to do with creation of cooperatives, communes, networks of mutual sharing, and building on those networks which already exist in many societies. Many so-called tribal societies already have systems of reciprocity, for example. Those can be drawn out, those can be not institutionalized exactly, but given maybe a more formal structure, they can become ways in which economic life can be practiced in ways that does not have either the kind of ecologically damaging forms that many forms of economy have, right? And it also does not disrupt the social relationships between people. And I can tell you many stories. We could stay here for ages. I don't know when the bell will ring, but I can tell you some stories. For example, one of my graduate students, I worked in Singapore one time, which is a very bottled up, anal society anyway, but that's another story, right? One of my students working in the Riau Islands. The Riau Islands are the part of Indonesia which you can actually see from Singapore. And she was working on local economy. She came into me and said, she discovered something very irrational. The village people on the coast, who were fishing people, would go into the nearest town and sell their fish to a Chinese middleman. The people from the interior would bring their vegetables and coconuts and so on to the Chinese middleman and sell it to him. Then the village people would buy fish from the Chinese middleman, and they would buy their vegetables. And I said, this is totally stupid. Why don't you guys just exchange with one another? Their answer is very simple. It said, because it will violate our sense of social reciprocity with one another. Because economic bargaining is bound to introduce some elements of conflict. Your fish are too expensive. This is ridiculous. You want 5 coconuts for this little thing? Yes, I say, no, this is too much. We're going to argue. We're all going to become little capitalists. So in fact, this apparently irrational economy of both interior and coastal people selling to a middleman was in fact rational in terms of their higher purpose, which was to maintain the harmony of social relationships. That was what really counted, not profit. Okay? This is not uncommon. Any anthropologist would tell you hundreds of examples of societies which have this kind of thing going on. So the idea behind the notion of social economy or solidarity economy is in fact to rethink economics in ways which are positive to the maintenance of ideal, as far as we can get to, ideal or harmonious social relationships. Let's say one level of this is looking at the way in which people have formed cooperatives, for example. But there's another level, which is a bit tougher intellectually, but I've been struggling with this for some years. Mainstream neoclassical economics, the kind of economics which underlies basically the capitalist system, is the dominant way of thinking about economic relationships, value, and the world. If you stop to deconstruct that neoclassical economics, you find you go in some very, very interesting directions. For example, not myself, but one of my colleagues at another university has talked about the idea of virtual economy, by which he means not, some absent, floating economy floating around in cyberspace. What he means is that neoclassical economics creates the categories for which it purports to describe the world. Does that make sense? It creates the categories for which it purports to describe. So if, for example, it uses a descriptive category like efficiency, in fact, there's no such thing. It's creating a category called efficiency, which it then measures with the tools of its own forms of economic analysis. Okay? But what if I change the paradigm entirely? Let me tell you another example. There's a wonderful anthropological study which was done in the highlands of New Guinea by an Australian anthropologist called R.F. Salisbury. And the book that he wrote about this is called From Stone to Steel. Okay? Now, I have been in New Guinea. In in fact, that many of the interior peoples have a very, very basic material culture. Okay? Australian aid agencies came to the very simple, obvious, rational conclusion that if you gave these people steel tools, they could greatly increase their productivity. I remember a student once taking a course in archaeology or prehistory, and one of our practical things was making stone tools. You could try this at home, okay? And believe me, it's hard work. You hurt your hands and fingers all the time. Every time you're chopping the bloody thing, you know, it breaks. You know, just at the last, you've just got your arrowhead perfect, and you have one more chop and it shatters. You've done the whole bloody thing again, right at the beginning. It's not fun. It's not very efficient in terms of, you know, getting stuff out of nature, harvesting, you know, doing things like that. So we give them steel tools. So they give steel tools, right? This guy Salisbury went back about a year or two, 2 years later, to evaluate the effectiveness of this development project. What he discovered was the level of productivity was exactly the same as it had been before the introduction of steel tools. So what's wrong with you people? I mean, the technology, you know, this. The answer turned out to be very simple. It had two elements. One was that these stone tools enabled them to do about the same amount of harvesting they did in the past in half the time. So A, what did they do with the spare time? They devoted it to their favourite activity, which was dancing. Okay? Lots more dance time. Because you never spend all your time in the jungle hunting and stuff, right? Number two, very familiar argument. Any economic anthropologists can give you hundreds of examples of this. They were afraid that people who were more efficient at using the technology would become richer. And this would introduce social inequalities into the society, which they did not want to happen. The existing technology, by its very nature, did not really allow some people to become substantially richer than other people. Now, what's all this got to do with spirituality? A lot of fun stories, right? It's got a lot to do with spirituality, because I would suggest, I think most of us here would probably agree that a huge number of our current planetary problems, you know, this ecological damage, you know, resource depletion, you know, destruction of natural habitats, and blah, 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 inequality, the negative effects of globalization, etc., are in fact traceable to our economy. If that is the case, what people ought to talk about from the pulpit of churches is economics. Because it's economics which, to a great extent, determine our daily life structure, including, somebody mentioned consumption. Did you mention consumption, right? Our consumption activities, you know, how we structure our time. And you could try a simple experiment here. It works, okay, I can guarantee, but you try it out for yourself. If I'm hurrying somewhere and I bump into a friend, say, hi, I haven't seen you for ages, you know, I say, yeah, but I can't really talk to you now, I'm having fun. You know, what's wrong with you? You don't want to talk to me because you're having fun. You know, they're going to be very upset by this. If I bump into the same friend and say, actually, I'd love to talk to you, I haven't seen you for ages, I'm going to work. I say, oh, sorry, don't let me delay you. What's the difference? The difference is, of course, that we've allowed economic values to dominate other kinds of social and cultural values. If we can't get away from that, we're going to have immense spiritual problems forever. So that's my point number one. Okay. And as I say, it may seem that, you know, economics doesn't sound like a normal spiritual practice. You think of meditation, prayer, you know, going to church, going to the temple, whatever. I would suggest that it is. It's a profound spiritual practice, actually, because it's one of the ways which you can reshape both the world and your inner nature, because your values themselves will shift as your thinking about economic values and practices shift. That's one. The bell hasn't gone yet. Number two, one of the things that was on the schedule for yesterday, which we didn't talk about in your session, was utopias. Now, I kind of like utopias. Some people don't. I mean, there are people who think, well, utopias are dangerous things because they're simply fantasies. You know, you're going to create ideal worlds, you know, the coconuts just drop off the trees, you know, the fish jump out of the lagoon without having to do anything about it. You don't have to think about utopias in this way. I think you can think about utopias as ways in which we would seriously think through what social, economic, political alternatives might look like. You know, how to achieve them, how to get away from some of the negative effects of many either literary or other utopias that people have tried. Marx was very opposed to this. We saw utopias as being really opposed to so-called scientific socialism because they had this idealist idea. But in 19th century France, there were lots and lots of these examples. Phalanges and Fourier, and the problem with a lot of them was they were kind of a bit totalitarian. You all had to wear the same stuff, you ate the same food, at the same time, in the same mess. It's a bit like Fireflies, in other words, so, it's fun for a few days, but you think, for God's sake, I'm really missing a job. Anything around here, there's no shop. There used to be a shop. What happened to the shop? Sit down, we still have a shop. Anyway, they probably don't have what I want. Anyway, obviously, you have to address those questions of the negative idea, possibilities behind planned economies, which can in fact impose on other people a form of life which may not be, in fact, the form of life which they would actually spontaneously choose for themselves. Now, how do you talk about utopias? Now, one of the fields in which I also work, and often actually, oddly enough, people often don't put together things like solidarity economy with something else I work on a lot, which is art. Okay? And it seems to me that art is also one of the most powerful mechanisms for approaching what we usually call spirituality. There's a lot of bad art as well, I'm afraid, but in principle, art opens up possibilities. I can paint my vision of something, and you may come and look at it and say, what's this? You say, well, it's my vision of something, right? I think it's horrible, I don't want to buy it, right? But you might like it, right? I think, oh, this is really good. And I can explain to you what I was trying to achieve through that imaginative act. And it's precisely, I think, that possibility of intervening in the world through imaginative acts that gives art its social power. Furthermore, art is one of the few forms of fantasy which is socially legitimate. Again, if that doesn't make sense, let me explain again. If I'm just a fantasist, total fantasist, this guy's really, I probably am, I probably should be in a mental institution, none of this is real. I'm wandering around with all these amazing ideas about what everything is like, and it's total fantasy, right? Okay. So, you commit me to a mental hospital. But as an artist, I can do the same things. And you can come to my studio and say, what's this? Well, it's my vision or something. And far from being committed to a mental institution, you might part, if I'm lucky, with a very large sum of money to buy my fantasy. Stick it on your wall, or whatever you want to put it. That's what I mean by socially legitimate. Art is one of the few spaces in society where you can give fantasy a free run. And by the way, the notion of fantasy is interesting. Down at the bottom here, where one of those granite things which Siddhartha loves so much, there's a quotation from Rumi. It's not the same quotation. In one of his writings, not one of his poetry, one of his writings, Rumi himself, the great poet, right, writes about the idea that when you talk about fantasy and reality, fantasy is actually stronger. It's stronger for two reasons. One is that we, in fact, live much of our emotional life in a world. If you use the word fantasy, it's actually a bit negative. You're just daydreaming. Let's face it. Most of us spend most of our days daydreaming. Do you too? Yes, if we admit it, okay? In other words, our inner life, our emotional life, our fantasy life, our imaginative life is, in fact, to a great extent, we're not really rational creatures. Okay? We're actually emotional and imaginative creatures. Okay? But you have to find a way of letting that out, and a way of letting that out which other people will accept as a kind of legitimate channel. The other thing that Rumi points out is that if you want to change society, the first thing you need is a vision of what the alternative would look like. There's no point in just saying, let's change everything, And people say, into what? Well, I don't know, but, let's just change it. It's probably going to be worse afterwards than it is before. As many revolutionaries have discovered, as we know, the right-wing critique of revolutions is often, it was actually better before. If you really want to choose between the Tsar and Lenin, or Lenin and Stalin, I'd rather have the Tsar. This kind of left you alone, didn't dragoon you into all sorts of things, and certainly didn't all that kind of stuff, right? So, My second suggestion is that we think seriously about art or the arts in the context of spirituality, not as a substitute. Somewhere else, in fact, Rumi again says this. I'm a big fan of Rumi, and I'm sure many of you are. Also says this, actually, a quite interesting point. He says, don't confuse spirituality with art. Many people do. You know, I've met lots of people, you know, art has now become their religion. You know, they will actually tell you, so I don't know, this is my religion. So don't confuse the two. It's not the same, but it's the vehicle through which you might approach or even reach that goal that you're looking for. Okay. Just a couple of concluding thoughts. Maybe two concluding thoughts. I don't know if you've ever heard the name of another poet, Octavio Paz, P-A-Z. Mexican poet, won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and was Mexico's ambassador to India. And experienced that huge influence both on his poetry and on his writing. He's also a great essayist. He's written lots of volumes of essays. So he had a huge influence on his thinking and writing. And in one of his essays, he says something which I think maybe I should inscribe it over my desk or something like this. This is a quote from him. He says, imagination, colon, right? Imagination, the faculty of humanity to change itself. Okay? Imagination, the faculty of humanity to change itself. And I think he was basically right. Not only in the sense of the more fantasy aspects of imagination, take you in any number of directions, but for another reason. And one of us, I think we were talking about this last night at dinner, right, were we? Something about the idea. One of the ideas that rarely discussed in this kind of forum is psychology. Now, having worked in kind of what I suppose used to be called development studies, you know, one way or another, very interesting question arises of, number one, what does trigger change? What persuades people that they should change maybe long ingrained habits to something else? Or conversely, why do people resist change? And again, you know, anybody who's worked in this field can give you any number of examples. You see, these people are behaving irrationally. You know? Why don't they adopt the new seed? You know, why don't they adopt the new irrigation system and so on? But they have their own cultural reasons for doing this. In some cases, of course, it is desirable that change should take place. And to find the mechanisms which will encourage people, not through coercive mechanisms, but giving them a different vision of what that future might look like after they've adopted the kind of transformations that you're recommending to them, will, of course, trigger change. And it triggers, in my experience, a particular kind of change. It's not that they just follow your blueprint. Nobody ever follows your blueprint in development studies. Right? What will happen is they will become owners or co-owners of the change process in which they are participants. Again, anybody who's been around in this field knows very quickly that the top-down approach rarely works, because when people don't have ownership of the changes which you're trying to encourage them to adopt, they abandon them. My own boss, when I worked for the UN one time, he worked in, amongst other places, Sudan. And this was one, I left there before I came 7 years ago, must be more than 7 years ago, we were talking about this one day. He'd gone back to the Sudan to look at a number of the projects that he'd been responsible for initiating when he worked for Canadian, he's a Canadian, for the big Canadian Development Agency, IDRC or something like this, it's called, what it's called. Anyway, it doesn't really matter, right? Their major aid agency said they'd all vanished. They built a beautiful road, it was covered in sand dunes. You know, they built something else and it had just been abandoned, nobody used it anymore, and so on and so forth. It was a terribly depressing experience. You know, to go back and look at this thing you'd invested so much money and time and planning expertise, and they were just abandoned. And I suspect the reason was they hadn't actually asked people what they wanted, and they hadn't actually involved them in the process of conceptualizing what they wanted. This can apply in many areas, and I really will stop at this point. I have an architect friend, and the first step in is, you know, if a client comes to him, a potential client comes to him, says, you know, we like your work, we've seen other examples, and we really think we'd like you to be the architect of our new house, our new building, whatever it was. The first thing he does, he gives them a piece of paper, and he says, draw what you think you want, right? Or make a collage or whatever form you would like. he will then build his more professional model, if you like, of what that building will ultimately look like, and it won't fall down, you know, on the basis of the way they conceived of their dwelling space, not the way he conceived it. And almost all of us have had the experience of living in buildings. You think, I wish the architect had lived in this building. I taught in a famous architectural school once in Germany, the Bauhaus University. And one of my colleagues had built his own house. And having dinner with him there one day, he said, you know, now I realize how many mistakes I made. You know, I thought this should go there, you know, or something, under the stairs should have something, or you can put something next to the kitchen, you know. No, I actually live in the house. You know, I have to live with my own mistakes. Unfortunately, it's not a client, you know, to live with the mistakes. He had to live with the mistakes, right? And I think that was a very important question. You know, when you ask your client, as it were, what they want, what is their imaginative vision of what they would like, what is their sense of well-being, they will almost certainly be able to tell you. The role of a professional then is not to impose that model, it's to encourage the fruition of that model, you know, to help it flower into what will eventually become, you know, the final.
You made me remember Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her verse which said, the earth is crammed with heavens and every bush burning a fire. Only he who sees it takes off his shoes, the others sit around and pluck blackberries. Or blueberries, one of those berries. But yeah, just the idea of if we have to find love and compassion and spirituality, it's there in pretty much everything, whether it's art or economics or the most material of things in life. So thanks for bringing that to us.